As we move along in this journey, I'm going to recap just so that no one loses their ball in the weeds in terms of where we've been and where we're going. You remember when we started, we talked about the importance of us, of God's space starting in us, that our hearts are the heart of the matter. And we have to start by offering our heart to God as He speaks to us about the attitudes of our heart. And then the next natural progression is for us to begin to see, offer our eyes, for us to begin to see the world the way Jesus did. But in the story of the Good Samaritan, you would find that not only did he see the world the way Jesus wanted him to, but his hands were dedicated or consecrated to do something about what he saw. So we want to talk about how to serve our way into having spiritual conversations with others. And what I'd like to do here is talk about something that I really believe a lot of times keeps us from getting more involved with those who are presently, maybe should we say, who presently don't believe and behave like us. One of the big attitudes I find as I travel all over the world that really trips a lot of Christians up is that we tend to confuse two words that many times keep us from maybe getting involved with people who are presently not yet Christians. We confuse the words acceptance with endorsement. And we're going to talk about that for just a moment, because if you think about Jesus, I want to suggest as you study the Bible that Jesus was always offering radical hospitality. He was always moving towards people who presently did not believe and behave like himself. In fact, so much so that he earned a title from those who didn't see it the way he did, the Pharisees. He became known as a friend of sinners. If we, as a faith community, as a church, are going to turn outward, I think we need to reimagine what that would look like in this day and age. And if we're going to do that, we're going to have to understand, how do we balance this tightrope walk of offering radical acceptance, but not necessarily endorsing everything that someone is doing or believing. This is a real challenge we all face. And yet Romans 15:7 very clearly communicates to us this idea that we need to accept others just as God has accepted us. That we've experienced radical hospitality. And that God has invited people like us to experience this relationship with Him. And so we're admonished by the Bible to actually turn outward and do the same for others. What I'd like to do is share two stories, true stories that actually came from people who actually sat through one of my workshops, and they came up and voluntarily shared these with me, that kind of illustrate this whole idea of the difference between radical acceptance and endorsement. The first story was told by a youth pastor who actually befriended two young ladies who he described as really out there. And as he described what out there looked like, I'm like, they are really out there. And let me just say, if you're going to get out there, you got to be ready to kind of, it gets a little messy. It kind of puts us in situations where we're faced with all kinds of things conflicting and being stirred up inside of us. In his particular case, he befriended these two young ladies, and eventually they felt safe enough with him that he felt like it was okay to finally invite them to come to church. And because he'd earned the right to be heard, because they trusted him, because he had created some God space, they actually showed up. And he was so blown away. As only God would have it, on that particular Sunday when they came, there was a guest speaker who had come in from out of town and was speaking that particular Sunday. And as he was talking about having this relationship with Jesus, he invited people to actually come forward. And this youth pastor was nervously watching these two young ladies to see what they would do and how they would respond to this invitation to actually experience Jesus for themselves. The one young lady turns to her friend and said, I'm actually thinking about doing this. Could we go outside for a moment? Because I want to talk to you before I make this kind of a decision. And they walked outside, and as they walked outside, one of the elders in the church had caught his attention, and he, of course, was a little put out that these two young ladies had decided to get up right in the middle of a service and just walk out. As far as he was concerned, that was pretty rude. As he went out there, what he did is he stumbled upon these two young ladies, and they both, of course, were doing what came natural to them. They lit up and were smoking a cigarette because they were nervous. They were really, this was really challenging them, and one of them was giving serious consideration to becoming a Christian. As this elder came upon the scene, he just came unglued. Because in his mind, they were actually doing something to pollute their bodies, and to do that actually on God's sacred ground called the church. And he just began to berate them. Young ladies, what are you doing with yourself? Why are you defiling your temple, your body? Why are you doing this here at this place called the church? This is God's holy ground. Immediately, these two young ladies immediately they just got out of there as fast as possible because that guy literally scared them away. In his mind, I think he thought he was being a good churchman. He was reminding them that, hey, your behavior is that's just not acceptable here. Another story told to me, flip the story around, and there was one particular church who had a sign out front that says, come, you'll be welcomed here. And so one young man who was labeled in the community as a real hellion, he actually decided to put the sign to test. And as I can only imagine just meeting this young man, he was described to me as one of those guys who had a pink mohawk right up here, and his jeans had huge holes in, and he purposely waited till the service was about half over and the pastor had already started his message. And he made it a huge entry into the church because he slammed the doors as they came in, and he walked right down the aisle and sat down on the floor, not in the pews, on the floor, right in front of the pastor with no shoes on. Can you imagine the looks of the people in the church on that particular Sunday? But there was an old man in the back, in his 80s. He was an elder emeritus. He had served for many, many years as an elder at this church. And as he saw what had happened there, he got out of his chair and he made his way up the aisle with, kind of baby stepping to this young man. And he gets up there to him and leans down and he says, puts out his hand and says, starts to shake and says, we're so glad you're here. And he sits down right beside him. What a difference radical hospitality makes when we say to people, hey, you might not believe and behave like we do, but that's okay. You'll be welcomed here. Now, I'm wondering as you listen to those two stories, if you've ever experienced radical hospitality and what that did inside of you as someone looked past maybe where you presently were and what you look like and all the other kind of things we kind of tend to prejudge people on, and just met you right where you were and offered radical hospitality. Anybody have a story like that? Yes, right here.
This is a story about my parents, and my parents are really passionate about working with international students as a means to share the gospel and share hospitality and share our culture. And my mom a couple years ago was in a hospital just for a regular checkup and saw conflict between a Saudi Arabian couple and the staff working there, and she could tell they're just having a really hard time communicating what they needed, and that the couple was trying to say something and the staff was just really frustrated. They couldn't kind of get their point across, and the staff kind of gave up on the situation and walked away, and my mom could tell the couple was still feeling not satisfied with the response that they got. And so my mom went up to the couple and said, "Salam alaikum," and they go, "You speak Arabic?" And she goes, No, I know the traditional greeting. And she helped them figure out what they needed to communicate, and she was able to kind of act as a mediator between them and the hospital staff. And they were so grateful. They started crying. She was pregnant, the woman was pregnant, and they were able to figure out their situation, but that developed into a really deep friendship. And my parents had that couple over once a week for a long time, and they actually asked my mom if she would tutor them in English. And through that whole experience, my parents got to share the gospel with them and got to share our culture with them. And we had them over for all holidays, and And they wrote back to their families in Saudi Arabia and told them this was their new family that had adopted them in the United States. And they are still in contact and have now heard the gospel through that relationship.